In the next series of videos, I'm going to show you how to create an HTML5 page and develop a template from it using Dreamweaver. I have Dreamweaver open. I am on my site. I'm going to click on my root folder and right-click and create a new folder and call it Week 6. I'm clicking on Week 6 so it's active. Then you see the blue bar. That means that when I go to File and create a new file, eventually when it's saved, it's going to look for Week 6 to save it. I want to make sure that I am developing an HTML5 page. I'm not going to be too concerned about the title just yet. I'm just going to click Create. Going to click on Design. Be sure that you're working with Design and not necessarily with the Live. There's many of options with the Live, but for now we're focusing mostly just on working with Design. Make sure that if you don't see things the way that I do, I'm working with the beginner workspace. So you can change that to this. Basically, I see my files, my CSS designer, and my insert folder. I move my insert folder to the top of the page. That's just a personal preference. You can put it wherever you want. You can keep it in the sidebar. Earlier in the course, I showed you the website layout using HTML5. It's just a very basic page layout. This is developed by W3 Schools. They have it on their page at w3schools.com, and they show you not only that image that I'm copying, but also the sample code. We're going to create all this sample code using Dreamweaver. So it helps me, at least, to develop a recipe for this page. There's a very simple recipe already developed to the side of this. It will be your preference what you want to call the IDs to all of these parts. In the HTML layout, they actually use any IDs for anything. They just use the straight nav, section, footer, etc. I'm going to actually use IDs along with all the semantic tags. Bringing in my notepad, I'm going to be moving it in and out as I develop the recipe. I know I'm going to have a header. I'm going to have a navbar. I'm going to they have a section, and then it's a section on top of an article, and then they have the aside, and I think that this is mostly for illustration purposes. You could have a section on top of an article and an article next to an aside. The truth is that all of these are interchangeable, but if you follow Dreamweaver, at least my lessons, and you see that section that has that little sectioned off icon, I consider section to be some sort of a wrapper where articles and asides can live, and that's the way that I'm going to develop my pages. Again, this will be personal preference for you. I'm switching back just to continue the recipe. I'm going to, like I said, instead of section and article and then aside, I'm going to have a section, and inside of the section I'm going to have an article and an aside. After all that, then I'll have a footer. And these are going to be the parts of the recipe that I'm going to need to define. One thing that I will be using, at least for this template, I'm going to use a body width of 960 pixels. So I'm going to remind myself at the top that the body is 960 pixels across. 960 pixels. The header, by inheriting the body, every other option, actually, every other part of the layout, all the elements will start out as 960 pixels. We will be changing some of them as we go along, so I'm not necessarily going to repeat the 960 pixels just yet. The header will be called page header, and the nav will be called page nav. I use the same titles for most of my examples, so just bear with me. Page section, though, I'll call it, I don't want to call it a page section, so I'm going to call it the main content, actually. So it makes a little bit more sense to me. Article will be inside of that main content, so I'll call it content article. And the aside, I'll call it content aside. The footer will just be simply page footer. So I know my page header will be 960 pixels wide. I'll go ahead and repeat it, 960 pixels. My page navigation will also be 960 pixels. My main content will hold 960 pixels. My article content, that's going to be this side of the layout, I'm going to maybe dedicate 600 or maybe 700. No, I'll go with 600. I'll say that it's going to be 600 pixels wide. And the aside will be whatever 960 minus 600 is, which in this case is what, 360? I hope so. Page footer will also inherit 960 pixels. You'll notice that at this point I'm really not too concerned about any height for anything, but at some point we'll be bringing in some height to the recipe, especially when we start to consider what kind of content we're going to have in the page. Let me switch back into Dreamweaver, and I'll move this slightly to the side so that I can see my workspace, and I have my week 6 ready. I'll just keep this open and try to keep it within your sight. I'll be moving it in and out of the way if it gets in the way. I am in the design mode, like I said. I have my insert tab on top, and I'm going to click and drag a header into the layout. Because this is the first thing in the layout, I will keep it at the insertion point, just wherever it lands. I'm going to give it the ID that I chose, page header. Remember to either use the camel case or all caps or all lowercase or an underscore to divide the words, but never use any spaces when naming IDs or page titles or anything. Well, never mind the title, but page names. Don't confuse the system by adding spaces. I'll click OK. So my content for ID page header goes here, is set. I'm going to next do the navigation. The nav is right here next to the header. When I click and drag down, I'm going to insert this after the tag that I just put in, which was page header. I'm going to give it the ID of page nav. And accepting that, next comes the section. Section is this little tab right here. Drop it in. I'm going to put it in after the tag that I just left there, which was the page nav. I'm going to give this the ID main content. Click OK. Next comes the article. Article is this little icon with the box floating inside. I'll drop it in. This is where things change a little bit, and I'm glad that Dreamweaver finally fixed this, because now we can insert not just at the insertion point, but we can actually go to the after the start of the tag. And that is after this main content starts. That's the holder that's going to have everything inside of it. We can say after the start of the tag, section ID main content. Click to select that. My ID will be content article. And then I'll click OK to accept that. And you'll see that content article now appears above main content. It's actually inside of it. Next, we can bring in the aside. Is this icon right here? I'll drop it in and say insert this after the tag that I just put in, which was the content aside, actually the content article. And let's select that content article, and I'll give this a class ID of well, actually the ID of content aside. I'll click OK. So now that's after article. And finally, the footer comes in. Footer is this. I'm going to say that I want it before the end of a tag, and that tag is body. So it's the very last thing on the page. The ID will be page footer. Now I'm going to go and check my code, and I see that I have my entire HTML5 code is written for me. I have the body, I have a header with an ID of page header followed by page navigation. We do have the section ID with main content. Inside of that, in lines 11 and 12, we have placed an article and we have placed an aside. That's all followed by the footer just before the body ends. So building a page in Dreamweaver is very intuitive. It's very easy to accomplish. We're going to be building a template that we're going to use on multiple pages. We'll be able to build an entire website using just this one piece of code. I'm going to go back to design, and I'm going to make sure that I save this. I'm going to go to File and tell it to save as a template. And let's call this my first template. Let's just call it my template. Description will be first attempt at a template. There are no existing templates in my site. Let me click on Save, and something magical is happening. And well, it's not really magic, but it's pretty neat. A new folder has been added to my site. It's called Templates. This is where my template will actually live. It doesn't have an HTML extension. Instead, it has a DWT, and that means that's a Dreamweaver template. And we'll be able to create and develop larger sites using just this one template. Now that my template is saved, in the next video I'm going to start CSS coding so that we can give this page some style.